Longtime radio broadcaster Larry Fedoruk turned to podcast last year. I Was 8 focuses on his childhood growing up in Saskatchewan. The move seems to have paid off as he's up for a Canadian Podcast Award next month. Congratulations on your nomination, Larry.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be nominated. It's what they always say, and I finally really understand that because a lot of podcasting is working in solitude and you get response from people when they hear the podcast, but to get this was really just really nice at a perfect time.
You've been in isolation, as you say, during COVID, and it's probably a perfect time to approach something like this project.
I had been working on the idea of a podcast even before I left the radio station, and I just wasn't sure what it was going to be, and I had been putting things together. And when you're new to this world, like, what do I do? How do I get a microphone? Like every little detail. And I was putting all that together and writing a series of essays, which I hoped would be published one day. And this old broadcaster trick, I would proofread out loud, because when you're reading a script, you tend to notice the mistakes more. So I would be proofreading them. And as I proofread them out loud every week, I was writing one story a week in 2018, 2019. It sounded like a podcast to me suddenly. And then that was going to be my podcast. And like, when am I ever going to find the time to do this? And then with the help of Bell Media, I found the time. And it became this podcast. And it was a good time to get into it, because then isolation happened. And I could work from this studio, this office at home, and just dive into it.
Why the focus on when you were 8? It seems like an odd choice right off the top.
My mom, who's still with us, she's going to be 93 this fall. I got a chance to spend more time with her and visit more with her. And that's when the story started. Hey, remember when remember when you did this and this happened? And I started remembering more and making notes. And I thought, boy, this would be funny to write these stories up, if for nothing else, just family history. And maybe I can make them entertaining enough to be interesting to other people. We'll see. And I started making notes. How many stories do you have? And the list just kept growing. And I had 52. And during the podcast, I sort of came up with 13 more. And I thought, well, that's it. I don't want to be one of those series that just hangs around too long, so I ended up with 65.
How has the response been? Have you received quite a bit of feedback from people saying, oh yeah, I remember when that similar thing happened to me?
That's the response I was looking for. It's not as much as, well, it is to the extent of I want my story to be entertaining, and I want people to get a kick out of it and laugh, and not necessarily learn a lesson. It's not always that. I don't care about that as much. If one's there, I try and work it in. A couple of the punchlines of a couple episodes are, as usual, I learned nothing. As a kid, I didn't learn anything from that experience. But mainly entertain, and then to have people remember, as you said, to kind of trip something that happened to them. And that's a lot of the feedback I get.
Were you surprised with this nomination? Have you checked out any of the 4 competitors in the personal podcast category?
Briefly, I have, yeah. I'm not as big a podcast listener as one would think. I have a few favorites that I go to, and it's usually not on a regular basis. It's episodes and things that I will like because of a particular subject matter. So I mean, they're all good. And when I went, and people have asked, why didn't you just do a radio talk show kind of podcast? And I still might. But this I had, and one of the things I always liked doing on the radio show was tell stories, regardless of whether they were about me or my past or present or future. The storytelling was the favorite. So when in the personal series, I really appreciate these people being personal and telling their stories. And it's a tough category. I mean, I know it's cliche, maybe nobody's believing me, but I'm just happy to be nominated.
Later that same life, so now you've wrapped up I Was 8, you're moving into later stages of your life. What is this new podcast going to be like?
When I was 8 and it started to resonate and catch a little bit, people would say, "What's next?" I was 9. And I would always go, "Yeah, that's good." And I wasn't really sure at that point and wrestled with it for a long time. And I've got like 2 or 3 ideas, but I mean, I can't do 5 podcasts a week of different topics, at least not yet. So what was going to be the next one podcast? And it finally went, well, every other story that happened, whether it happened to me when I was 10 or 25 or yesterday, that's the idea of Later That Same Life. It's kind of the rest of the stories, if you will. There's one episode already up, I guess 2 now, just 2 starting. One is from a little bit later in the same small town when I was 13. One is a few years later. And then the third one I'm making is it's actually about vinyl and people trying to collect records back in the day and moving on through all the different formats. So it's maybe it's got a personal bent to it. It's maybe less that. It's more a story of a subject matter. So that's going to be the idea of it. Some personal stories, commentary, opinion, all kind of mixed into what happened to me later that same life.